In looking at U.S. foreign policy, we have to begin with the foundation of U.S. foreign policy since really George Washington's presidency. Isolationism is where we began, and that is that whole idea of staying out of foreign affairs. This was George Washington's advice and what the United States basically followed from the time of his presidency all the way through the end of the 1800s, and that does begin to change. With the introduction of imperialism, which is that policy where a stronger country controls a weaker country in order to gain new markets and access to natural resources by either military force or by overthrowing a government. You could also talk about this taking colonies for economic interest. It's all about, most of the time when you look at this, it's all about the economic gain that the mother country can possibly have from that type of policy. Now, we're not the only ones in the United States who are doing this whole imperialism foreign policy. Every other major world power at the time were building their empires throughout the world. So we're not the only ones with this policy of imperialism, but it was new to us at the end of the 1800s. Jingoism is an idea of extreme patriotism in the form of aggressive foreign policy. So basically, we're so proud of our country that we begin using our military and other forces, our economy, to get what we want in other places. Instead of allowing things to happen, we're making things happen. And remember, we're coming right out of that industrial revolution where we are the world's leading producer of goods, so we need new markets for our products. We need new places to sell our stuff. That's going to be a really big driving force and a lot of what this imperialist foreign policy is all about. We also want to extend our spheres of influence. We not only want to take our markets, we want to take our culture, we want to take our civilization and our religion. So those are going to be some really big motivating forces that are driving us into other areas of the world. So our sphere of influence is going to be an area or region where we are going to exert some type of indirect cultural, economic, military, or political domination. And again, you see us exercise this in a variety of ways during this time period. We do begin building an empire. It goes all the way back to the purchase of Alaska in 1867. Now, at the time, it was seemed ridiculous that we would buy this basically ice box. In fact, people ridiculed it so much, they called it Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox because there wasn't any seen as any real value there. However, that doesn't last long. After we did purchase this piece of land from Russia, we do discover gold there and many other natural resources as time goes on. So there's one area where we're going to expand. Hawaii in 1898. We had very many American planters, people who are like growing crops, specifically sugarcane, pineapple, and other crops in Hawaii. At the time, Hawaii was governed by a monarchy, and the Queen of Hawaii's name was Queen Liliuokalani. When the United States government decided that they were now going to require that those American planters in Hawaii pay a tariff on those goods that they were shipping into the United States, led by a man named Sanford B. Dole, as in like Dole pineapple in your grocery stores. He is going to lead a revolution to overthrow the Queen of Hawaii. The Queen of Hawaii really did not fight back. She basically stated that she didn't want to see her people suffer at the hands of what a war would do. So they overthrew the queen to avoid paying that tariff. And we then later became a state in the mid-1900s. Alfred Mahan, he is going to be the author of a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. In this book, he discusses that the United States needs a strong navy. And in order to support that strong navy, we were also going to need refueling stations for that navy. So that, again, there's not much good in a navy if you don't have the fuel to keep it going if you're out in the middle of the ocean. So that will also be, when we begin building our navy, support the reason that we go out and take some of these little island nations in both the Atlantic and Pacific. Cuba has always been an interest of the United States. It is only 90 miles off of the coast of Florida, and because of that, we have always been interested in the possibility of expansion. We when we brought this idea to Spanish, because the Spanish had ruled Cuba for quite some time, they actually said they would rather see Cuba sink into the ocean than sell it to us. But they had become ruling Cuba very harshly. They were oppressing their people, treating them very poorly, putting their people in concentration camps, basically, in prison camps, to keep them under control. So the people of Cuba had begun reaching out to the United States and asking for our assistance. The yellow journalist press at the time. Now, yellow journalism is a really key concept you need to understand. It is this idea of exaggerating the news to sell newspapers. So basically, you want to get the catchiest headline. You want to put the best picture out there to get people to buy your newspaper. So they're going to take actual stories and exaggerate those to get people to buy those papers. So when you have the Spanish ruling Cuba very harshly, and then you're going to turn around and run those stories in your press, the American people become very familiar with what's going on in Cuba. Remember, they read newspapers like you guys check your social media feeds. Not too long after that, something called the Dillon Letter is going to be intercepted by the United States. This was written by a Spanish foreign minister back to Spain's government, talking about President McKinley, the U.S. president at the time, and calling him weak, saying basically that the Spanish had nothing to worry about because our president, the United States president, was weak and would not act. Now, obviously, this does not go over well in the United States. We do not like someone else calling our president weak. So we're going to send a ship to observe. Remember, we talked about how the U.S. military could be used as an intimidation factor, and that's exactly what this is. While the USS Maine was sitting in the harbor of Havana, the ship is going to explode. Now, while we still don't know to this day what exactly happened to that ship that killed many Americans, obviously, many Americans immediately, along with the United States press, are going to put the blame on the Spanish. This right here is all the United States needed to launch into war with Spain. The rallying cry becomes "Remember the Maine," and symbolizes that reason for our war with Spain. So the question is, what do we do first? Remember, I told you this Spanish-American War is going to be fought in Cuba. But that's not where we go. We don't go to Spain to attack. We don't go to Cuba to attack. The first place we go is the Philippines. The Philippines is in the Pacific, and it is a Spanish colony at this time when the war begins. Much of the Spanish fleet was located there, so George Dewey is going to go in and take out the Spanish fleet at the Philippines. And he's going to capture those islands. So the question is why? Well, once again, go back to that imperialist foreign policy. We are looking to expand. And if we could take them out there, then that's going to benefit our cause in the future. Also, it's going to take out much of the Spanish fleet to prevent them from using it in Cuba. So again, we see that imperialist foreign policy really being spoken about in the United States. In fact, we even have ministers like Josiah Strong who are even standing in the pulpit talking about that imperialism and talking about all the good that the United States could do around the world in spreading our culture and our religion to these other, what they would have called, uncivilized places. But not everyone felt that way. We also had anti-imperialists like Andrew Carnegie, who was the head of the Anti-Imperialist League, who argued that we had much more to worry about here in the United States as opposed to outside of the United States. So even though we might think that everyone wanted to go and expand our great nation, there were many who said, no, we need to worry about what's going on in our own backyard first. You see in this picture is a famous individual, this guy right here, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, who goes on to become president after President McKinley. When we go in to fight, we are fighting so that Cuba will be independent. That was our entire goal. We weren't going to take over Cuba. We just wanted them to be independent. So the Rough Riders, which were a cavalry unit led by Teddy Roosevelt, there he is, Theodore Roosevelt is going to lead them in a successful charge up San Juan Hill and in what is called the Splendid Little War, because it doesn't last very long. And we really lose more men to disease and to sickness as opposed to actual battle deaths. It's called the Splendid Little War. And at the end of it, Cuba is free. That's exactly what we were fighting for. That's exactly what happened. So the Treaty of Paris in 1898 is going to be signed, and it's going to recognize several things. One, we get Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico becomes part of the United States, which is very important. It is still a U.S. protectorate. In fact, they have voted numerous times not to become a state, but they are still under U.S. control and even vote in our elections. We are going to buy the Philippines from the Spanish. I want you to remember that because we're going to come back and talk about the Philippines and why we bought it and how the people of the Philippines felt about that. And finally, we also are going to gain Guam. So Guam also becomes a part of the United States. So what comes out of the Treaty of Paris? Cuba is free. The United States is going to gain several territories, including Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam.